Hello, everyone, and welcome to ISAR Starclub webinar. My name is Zoran Stanovic. I am a Global Director, ISAR Global Director for Serbia and Coordinator of Global Directors for ISAR. Tonight or today, I'm pleased to run or host a presentation of Mark Douglas from Canada. And before that, I would just like to remind you about some of the possibilities that you can join in ISAR. We have the ISAR Intensive coming in on the first Saturday in October, which is going to be run by Samuel Reynolds. And the title is there anything essential and dignified about essential dignities in the 21st century? So if you're interested, all the ISAR members have the privilege to see this ISAR intensive on the reduced price of $55. The rest pay $95. So today, I would like to introduce to you and present a little bit and say something a little bit about Mark Douglas, our today's presenter. Hello, Mark.
Hello, Zorana. How you doing?
Good, good. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much.
Mark Douglas is the founder of thesewithinyou.com. He provides psychosynthesis, coaching, and astrological consultations for clients around the world. He has a diploma in Huber Astrology from the APA in UK and is a member of the Association for Professional Astrologers. He is currently completing his honorary apprenticeship through John Frawley. He is the local representative for the Atlantic Association of Professional Astrologers and a teaching assistant with the Synthesis Center San Francisco Board Certified Psychosynthesis Coaching Programs. Okay, hello, Mark.
Hello, well done. I forgot half of that. That's great.
Yes. Okay, so just before you start, I would like to remind everybody that you can type in the questions, and at the end of the presentation, Mark would be kind to answer whatever you find is unclear to you. So Mark, I give you the word, and anxious to enjoy this presentation with everybody.
Perfect. Thanks so much to ISAR and Zorana. Thanks for the half-hour pre-chat. That was worth it right there for me alone. And as I mentioned as well, I'm used to Zoom with this, so if audio quality or if any points, Zorana, if you're getting chats from members to speak to something, or if you're not able to hear me properly, please let me know, because I'm here for you and I appreciate you being here. So that being said, I'll get on to stress planets, compensation, sublimation, and transformation. And yes, good evening, afternoon, morning, depending where you're calling in from. My presentation on these stress planets, it's meant to be decently kind of relaxed and hopefully enjoyable, and most importantly, useful. So I make mention of the sheer amount of research, namely the Gauquelins, which I'll speak to, and Hubers have done in this area. So we can take our time. I don't feel unnecessarily kind of pressurized to try and convince you of this research, because I have the books and everything at the end, some podcasts from the astrology podcast as well that you can really dig into. And for the purposes of today, I'm going to bring in a little bit of technique and whatnot, but hopefully keep it light, because sometimes I know what it's like to get into these seminars, and this isn't a workshop format, so I don't get to really re-clarify. I want to keep it gentle yet deep enough to kind of show you where the juice is. So that being said, for today, I want to give you a sizable taste into stress planets and enough of an idea so you can kind of carry on, do your research. There's three main areas for today I was hoping to kind of guide you through. I'm going to walk you through the basics of what are stress planets, some of the technical, behavioral, psychological, talk about the GoClans research and their Mars effect. Next, we're going to look at stress planets through the three house crosses. That's a system we use in the Huber approach, and I'll explain it all. Lastly, I'm going to weave in some examples here and there, but it's not going to be in-depth analysis over charts and stress planets. I just want to give you enough of a ride through so you can really relate to it. And then hopefully some practical things that we can do with our clients in a real coaching, consulting kind of format, support them in working with these juicy hotspots of stress planets in their birth charts. As I mentioned, I have at the end a list of resources if you want to dig deeper, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, just my email, contact info, shoot me a message, and happy to kind of give you a little bit of direction if I can do so. How's so far so good, Zorana? Audio is, everything's turning out okay?
All is good, Mark. Just
Perfect.
keep on going. Yeah.
Sounds good. I can talk for days, so I don't need any encouragement. To kind of start, this Prezi is aimed at the level of astrology that is here to kind of support personal development or insights and freedom. I mentioned that so we're clear. We see that the birth chart is really ours to discover, and that while it can be confusing to uncover charts for ourselves, as we know, and certainly clients at times, that the analogy of my flying window here, my fancy video that I made through canva.com, the analogy of a maze versus a labyrinth, I think, rings really true. So just quickly, a maze is a place you can get lost in. It has dead corners, that whole thing. But in a labyrinth, you can always find a way out. And I love this quote. I have no idea who said it, but it speaks to a bit of the work we can possibly uncover today with learning about pieces of ourselves within the birth chart as a gentle walk in a labyrinth, exploring around, knowing that no matter how deep we go, we can always pop out eventually. And for those that kind of had the ability to watch movies in the 80s, you never know, we might even bump into David Bowie today, perhaps. Shameless plug for one of my favorite movies, Labyrinth. Highly recommended, by the way. So all of this is thanks to the tireless work the Hubers have done, and certainly the GoClans. Bruno and his wife Louise, who contributed to astrological psychology of the Huber approach. They were German, Swiss psychologists, astrologers, esotericists. And while I study traditional astrology, my main system for natal work and psychosynthesis is absolutely the Huber method, which is an intensely researched, highly detailed, comprehensive way of working with a birth chart. And there's nothing really dramatically new in its concept because it follows a lot of traditional thinking in many respects. Once you pop the hood, take a look at it. They were very fortunate to have worked alongside Roberto Assagioli, the founder of psychosynthesis, who was a contemporary of Jung and Freud. And they'd actually lived with Assagioli in 58 for 3 years. And back in those days when we had access to chart files, and Assagioli literally worked with him on doing the research and provided him with all his hundreds of case files. So they were really working at a depth level with psychology and the birth charts. The Huber approach, I sometimes call it astrological psychosynthesis, is aimed to assist in the process of psychological and spiritual growth. It encompasses our heredity, environment, spirituality, and kind of links with the cosmos. Thus, we are made whole both within ourselves and in our integration with the world and the universe. So in other words, it's quite a simple system. just giving you a bit of an overview of the Huber approach, because I'm going to show you the charts that I know look a little bit different, and might as well just at least bring you into the Huber world a little bit. As a quick overview, there are, as you can count, 3 main charts used in the Huber approach. There's the natal chart, which you're all familiar with, and next we have 2 others, the nodal chart or the moon node chart, and the house chart. And we can use all 3 in any consultation, sometimes more, sometimes less, as we all know, depending on the client and the situation. So I'm going to walk you through a little bit of each one. Let's start with the moon node chart because it reflects our past and our shadow. It's really an amazing chart, and the book Moon Node Astrology by the Hubers is really worth checking into, and I can show you that later on. But yeah, it's called Moon Node Astrology. It gives information into our desire nature, and it symbolizes the astral body. In terms of depth psychology, it makes visible the shadow side of our personality. It shows where our motivations, wishes, actions from the past are kind of projected into the present. And it has a timing system in itself as well too, that I'll show in a second as it relates to the age point system. So when client concerns really press on, it's usually the node chart that we need to kind of peek into to catch a glimpse of underlying motivations and what those archetypes are up to. We have another chart, and this is another well-researched chart as well, called the house chart. And it seems a bit odd, but it's how the environment has kind of seen the individual and therefore tried to condition, etc., the individual. So it's a conditioned view. It's not the objective, real natal chart. It's that whole kind of nature and nurture question. I like the quote by Philip Larkin. They F you up, your mom and dad. They may not mean to, but they do. They fill you with faults they had and add some extra just for you. So the house system is actually drawn up using equal house system. So is the moon node chart for the technical bits. And you'll actually see in the moon node chart, if you ever draw one up, that the actual zodiac signs are elongated and shrunk down as though you're kind of looking down from the heavens down at the individual. That's that kind of subjective view. And this outer to kind of inner view that, you know, coaches, teachers, friends, parents, you name it, see from the outside down onto us. And it's not the real us, of course. So that's why we use the chart as it's a whole way of that kind of outer to inner view of working with the house chart. Okay, if that's good. Lastly, I have my last slide to kind of just chat with you about the Huber approach. Is one of the main timing systems we use. It's called the age pointer life clock, and it's what a lot of astrologers tend to use from the Huber system. It's an elegant, reliable timing system that works at kind of a progression timing system, or maybe a time lord of sorts. So it's an inner timing system that showcases various periods, sequences, chapters in a person's life. Essentially, without getting into it too far, because we're going to get into stress planets, is at the AC when you're born, time starts, and the hand of that clock moves counterclockwise. Each of the houses represents 6 years of life, no matter how big or small they are. So we're obviously dealing with a quadrant-based system. We use the Koch house system. And as the point of consciousness moves around the chart, it forms aspects, as you can see, conjunction right away with Pluto there. Those that use it do find an immense correspondence, level of correspondence, excuse me, between indications of the birth chart and the psychological crises or other events. So how to use it roughly would be put it at a macro level before progressions, before, you know, use it as a big level time lord system before you get into returns, transits, etc. So highly recommend it. If you want to give it a little bit of jot it down, then this book here, The Life Clock, is by far the most comprehensive book on how to use it. Okay. to talk about stress planets, we're getting there. We really need to, I learned this by doing a few presentations and workshops, that you need to clarify this weird looking Huber chart. Now, I normally don't leave this wave-like pattern on the outside for charts, but I'm just doing this to give the best example. Within the Huber system, there's actually 5 layers, to a Huber chart. The white center in the middle doesn't have any aspects or anything going through it. It really symbolizes the inner higher self, central core of the person that's both timeless and describable in nature, but the true self, if you will. It has a desire nature to push out. And the first thing that it does and creates is number 2 here, the well-researched aspect structure. This aspect structure, much can be gained from a birth chart just right in here. And there's about 45 different patterns and a whole process involved with it, but it really shows our inner wiring room of motivations, and you name it. Before we race off to the ascendant, I always like to say, so this inner kind of engine wiring room has a real motivation to itself. The next layer, as you would obviously recognize, getting into our planets, our psychological drives, they don't change. And the signs, obviously, they pick up the qualities of the signs as these planets move their way out. Last layer is where we're going to spend a whole bunch of time today really looking at. It's called the house system. It's our houses, just as you would know. And I'll explain that wave-like pattern in a couple slides, in case you're wondering. But what we have here is the 5th house represents literally the environment we live in, the house systems. So I'm going to explain this through this idea of a biopsychosocial perspective. What you get then, in a nutshell, is soul's expression blasting its way out, has an intentionality, goes through these layers and lands on planet Earth in the various houses where it spends its day. If you got a little bit of that, I do apologize that I have to show you Huber charts in this manner, because I know it's really challenging. I've been working with a study group now for the past month that we just reverted to using standard charts because I wasn't going to try to twist their brain in knots. But bear with me, please. So number 1 on my list, we finally got here. Let's get into these stress planets. What are they? So a little bit of the technical, behavioral, psychological, and I'm going to absolutely speak about the Go clans and their Mars effect research. So super basics, but what are houses? They represent the world, the environment, different areas of life experience. From the behavioral psychological point of view, the houses are the most important element of astrological psychology. They are the reference system to the real world, and they show the psychological processes which occur constantly between the individual and the environment. So it's where we live out our daily lives through the planets and signs. It's the stage we perform on, if you will. You already know most of this, so again, just to reaffirm what we're up to today, there's such an emphasis with what we're looking at today in the stress planets from the house level, so that's why we're going through these slides. Because the house layer is the furthest layer out, the emphasis is on how we carry our individual birth charts to this layer and relate to it. That's that biopsychosocial perspective of this layer of us meeting the real world and the environment, and inner you meets outer world and reality. As we know, the common keywords for houses, we're not doing horary here, so I'm not interested in the 12th house being large animals bigger than a goat or things of that nature. We're looking at kind of psychological life expression areas. So, as you know, 4th house of family and our roots, the 10th house, vocation, how we individuate, stand up, career, 7th house of relationships, that kind of thing. And yes, we live in the house system on a minute by minute basis. We would say we're I'm in my 4th house right now doing a bunch of 9th house stuff. So I promise I will keep this as easy as pie, hopefully. And it's my goal to show you this in a non-confusing way. To get into stress planets, we need to explore what is called this dynamic, funny little energy curve on the outside of the chart. The dynamic energy curve is perhaps one of the most researched parts of astrological psychology, at least within the Hubers. We're familiar with the 4 main points, AC, DC, IC, the MC. Those are real, as we know, energy points, massive energy points in the birth chart. In the dynamic house system, we have this wave-like curve, as you see, goes from house to house. So if each house had a point to it, we could draw lines and dips within them. This kind of wave-like curve of peaks and troughs goes all the way around the chart, and it shows available energy at any given place in the house system out in the real world. I'm going to definitely explain this a lot better. If you think of this soul expression coming from the inner white circle of the chart manifesting out, just think of this beaming kind of pulsating energy source. It's seeking to express itself out in the world, in the houses, as we know, via the aspects and the planets, through the signs. Depending on where our planets are placed in this curve, our ability for the planets to act, respond, and be used effectively comes into play. So that's the real plug. So far, so good. You're not supposed to understand at this point. I just want to give this idea that the wave-like structure relates to how we kind of meet the real world. Just try to get an image, visualize this wave going from house to house in the birth chart, so on and so forth. And it is important to note that we're using quadrant houses. The Hubers, the whole thing is forged on the Koch house system. So I will say that. I would love to say just use Placidus, but for the purposes of this, at least start with the Koch house system. That's where it was done. I wish we could equally say any quadrant system would work, but they did put a lot of effort into really researching how it works with Koch system, so I'll respect that. I'll try to unpack this dynamic energy curve for you. I'm going to break it down. So what we're looking at here is I've taken the MC. I've taken this slice here and transposed it over here. If we focus on one of these house areas, I'll break it down. Planets near a cusp, okay, on the counterclockwise side, so just past the MC. Any planets there are literally more out in the environment and will therefore be more easily expressed, good or bad, out there. And if you can register that, then the opposite is true. Any planet down here at the bottom of the trough of the curve will have a hard time getting their expression out. You know, just think of Mercury. If Mercury's out here, it's able to do Mercury type communicating stuff and whatnot, as opposed to being down at the bottom of the curve here. It's like they're down a well or something and are being muffled. That's the main gist of what I'm kind of going for. There's other points, but just stick with there for now. It's going to be more challenging for a planet to kind of get themselves noticed and heard and recognized by the environment as they're down below here. Don't mind me and my sense of humor. Cuspal planets are red hot for the environment to easily pick up on and therefore express easier or be heard. Low point planets are really down a well in terms of getting easily expressed to the outside world. So you sing on top of the mountains and boy, everybody hears you. And for those poor little planets at the bottom of the curve, they really have to struggle to get some notice. Hopefully that's landing okay for you. Here's the other rub. The psychological effect of each house begins at the low point of the previous house. So I know that's a mouthful. The planet, in this case Mars, sees the next house and wants to be in it. So Mars over here in the 9th house is aware of the 10th house. Just like seeing the peak of a mountain, you want it, you taste it. For example, with Mars in this 9th house is aware and wants to do Marsy type stuff in the 10th house of vocation, career, standing up, etc. But yet Mars is in the 9th house. It has 9th house duties to perform. Here's the important bit. The closer Mars would be in any given birth chart, the closer Mars is towards that MC, without going over, causes more stress to build as there's more and more interest and desire to be in that 10th house. The planet becomes more pushy, frustrated, competitive, etc. So the word stressed is kind of a great term to use, but you can use any term you'd like, of course. It literally robs energy from other areas of the chart of the person to engage with the next house affairs. That's starting to sink in. I have other slides, so we'll definitely build within it. I just want to give you this taste that stress moves as the planet would be located closer to that axis. Again, using Koch houses. Okay, it gets less complicated, I promise. I just have to try to showcase. We're still dealing with that house to house on the outside cusp area, if that helps. So stress planets are any planet before a house cusp, not just the 4 main points. So in other words, it doesn't have to be just the AC, IC, DC, or MC. It can be between any of the houses. They're going to be more through the 4 main points, but they'll work through any house. In this diagram, we're looking at that outside wave curve from house to house. And I'll try to unpack this for you. The planet here, as we said, has to fulfill the duties of whatever house it's in, plus it's really interested in the next house. So as that's not easy because the planet has developed what we call these compensatory mechanisms on various unconscious levels. As Carl Jung said, anything in the unconscious might as well not exist. So these planets and areas of our life, as you're working with clients, will largely govern, rule our life. Luckily, we have, astrology and a birth chart to see these expressions. In this diagram, there is a lot going on, so let's break it down. There are 3 main zones in every house. The house cusp relates to cardinal energy, and it's where that planet is absolutely red hot for the environment and very available energy. It can do its business. You can see this when we cast a chart for horary and we say which team is going to win. All things being equal, the planet closer to the cusp is probably going to win. You can start laying down your big bucks bet money, and that may be if there's any traditional astrologers out there, that might help a little bit with this ability to get its planetary expression out there. So it can do its business. The transition to the next is called a fixed zone, and there's this balance point where a planet is comfy cozy, bit of a Goldilocks zone of not too available, not too far down the well. So it's called the balance point. The bottom of the fixed zone is getting into this real fixed zone, and it's the bottom of the pit. This is called the low point, and yes, it sounds doom and gloom. There's very much redeeming qualities, but for the purposes of today, we could spend multiple sessions just on this dynamic house curve. For the purposes of today, planets here struggle to express themselves outwardly, like shouting down from a well, like I showed you in the image before, as I mentioned. As a fixed zone, the principles of really digging your heels in apply. There's resistance and steadfastness. Yes, of course, the sign it's in would have a major effect. But moving on, in the last zone, this is a mutable zone. So it's a dynamic energy that is really asking the plants to start increasingly start moving. As the last third area really into this zone is the super stressed zone. This is this idea of the planet being stressed as it's here, but very much so stressed as it gets, especially into that last third. And you can absolutely, there's a bunch of math involved, and I would suggest for most times you can just eyeball it. Stressed here, absolutely more stressed here. Hopefully that realized there could be some note taking, some questions later. I wrote a 5-degree rule here because how I'm taught in traditional astrology anyway, a planet within about, give or take, 5 degrees, we just say it's actually in the next house. So what we're saying in this diagram is, yeah, it really wants to be, and from a psychological effect, there's stress involved with that we're going to unpack. So the stress is this dual demand of energy. It's a great source of potential, so it can be really good, and demand, but there's the effect of two forces going on. So we have the little mountain climber person, I believe, or the climber, must serve ninth house higher learning and my vocation. It's too much stress. The person is confronted with very polarized demands. It makes it difficult to kind of focus on one area. So compensation occurs to really hone in on that area of life. Like the athlete that trains 8 hours a day for one competition, we never really get out what we put in terms of effort. Or that academic that collects degrees and knowledge at the expense of everything else. These are allergic points in the chart. One of the best known compensations is in sports, and we see this through the Mars effect, as researched by Michel Gauquelin and his wife, Françoise. Here's some background on the Gauquelins. Their work is the single largest statistical research into astrology, at least that I'm aware of, using hundreds of thousands of time charts. Michel graduated from the Sorbonne with degrees in statistics and psychology. He met Françoise, his wife there. Birth times are recorded and data is public record in France, or at least it was. This allowed them to collect and create database of hundreds of thousands of time charts. They were the first to run large-scale statistical studies with large sample sizes. They also collected data from other European countries, ran different statistical tests on the data, published the books with the results. According to the Gauquelin's research, elite sports people most frequently have Mars stressed before the AC. It makes people want to finish first at all costs, and there are strong correlations for Saturn on the MC and for scientists and other planets and vocations. Really interesting stuff. An absolute fantastic podcast, I've listened to it, of course, multiple times, would be episode 173 on Chris Brennan's astrology podcast. I'd highly recommend giving it a listen to hear the interview with Kenneth Irving, who's affectionately become known the Gauquelin guy. And there's many books and research available. Really fascinating. The book Kenneth was involved with called The Tenacious Mars Effect. And from the Gauquelin's Cosmic Influences on Human Behavior. Okay, so moving on to number 2. Hope everybody's going on well and I'm being decently coherent. These stress planets in the houses through the three crosses. To break it down and to give a little bit of examples, we'll play with each of the houses, and I think this will start to come a little bit more alive for you. We can get an image in our head about any planet positioned before a house cusp. Any planet there is technically stressed, any of the houses. The more close it is to the cusp, the more stress it is. So let's break this down. You're likely familiar with angular, succedent, and cadent houses, and you're probably having a visceral or somatic response to me calling them all of a sudden we're cardinal, fixed, and mutable, but just bear with it. Again, we're not changing anything. We're just saying how it interfaces with the real world, these planetary energies. In the cardinal zone, AC, DC, IC, MC, houses 1, 4, 7, and 10. It's a real expansion phase, cardinal expansion phase. At the AC, a burst of energy propels us into the world as we are born both into time and space. In the fixed houses, it's a contraction phase known as the succedent. Energy here is really focused on preservation, dealing with substance, status quo. And the mutable houses, I realize that can be a real brain kind of shift for people. Houses 3, 6, 9, and 12. Energy is beginning to expand again. So the processes of really thought, transformation, internal, are kind of in preparation for the next phase. This is kind of what's going on. Try to break this down. So we can look at stress planets in any of the kind of angular houses, the cardinal houses, houses 1, 4, 7, and 10. As we said, these are major angles, not just because they're stressed in front of them, but planets here are what are entering a new quadrant. So in the quadrant-based house system, they're leaving this area, moving into a whole new set of houses up into house number 4 here. So it's a massive, massive point. So it's any planet in front of the AC, IC, DC, and MC that we're looking at. I have a proper example of Margaret Thatcher's 3 stress planets that I'm going to dive into shortly. The planet will have a sense of a new beginning in front of these 4 main angles, of leaving behind the 12th house, for example, in front of the AC and coming into the light. There's a real cardinal push that inflates the ego. And I'll show you this with just athletes and Mars. There's a real feel to show itself impulsively, at that level. At the transpersonal level, those energies are too much for the ego, of course, and are powerful. So it can be a real agent of change. Uranus, as a personal catalyst for change in the world, can take on grotesque forms. I'm not going in depth with any of these charts. I want to lay a land for you so that you can walk away with kind of a broad scope. So to really land on this research with the Go clans, here's a picture of Mars in front of the AC. And sidebar note, in mutable signs like Sagittarius, it's very prominent. This is a chart of an athlete. Try their utmost to find sporting success. They're obsessed with pole vault, trained for years for the Olympics, that whole thing. Shortly before the Olympics, injured their hand, which was end of his sporting career. I just wanted to leave that in your head. I figured I couldn't talk about the Go clans and the Mars effect with at least showing one chart. I'm being a bit playful here. The IC is the bottom of the chart, the 4th house of family and roots. The emphasis of the planet here is about breaking free from the old ties and establishing our own families. There's a strong desire in these areas, and this is not a fully developed research into Mick Jagger's life, but when I was hitting my database within my Regulus system and up comes Mick Jagger's in front of the IC, I couldn't resist. So, when you have eight kids and a massive family, there has to be something to be said for that. But I more or less thought it was funny. I'm going to actually spend the time and really dig into Mick's chart, but this is just giving you a quick example. The DC is, of course, the 7th house of relationships, where we form one-to-one relationships, marriage, business, partnerships, you name it. So there's a real kind of stressed assertion of the person or the chart living out their lives in this pursuit, entanglement of the other. I'm keeping these examples vague since so much could be said and altered by respective charts, planets, aspects, fixed stars, you name it. But at a wide panned out angle, this is what we get from stress planets in this area, kind of in front of the DC. There's a story around relationships. In front of the MC, it's a massive power angle in a chart, right? It includes matters of vocation and how we stand up in the world. And with an emphasized T-square in this chart, we get no shortage of longevity and performance. This is Queen Elizabeth's chart with her stressed Saturn in front of the MC. We move along to the fixed cross, houses 2, 5, 8, and 11. Again, planets here are really mainly concerned with acquiring, stabilizing, and holding, more of an inner sense opposed to that cardinal stressed outward achieving kind of area and those planets. In the stress position in front of the second house, our own sense of security will be massively pulled. There'll be real urgency to acquire money or issues relating to self-worth, etc. So there's my bag of money, and just mentioning self-worth as well too. Bring in what you know about the second house already and apply it to what you know. The next fixed house, the fifth house, is the creative house, the house of also the collective ideals of friends, not the chosen groups we have in the 11th, but the collective set of friends. It's the house of sex and intimate relationships at that level, of course. We discover ourselves and feel safe when we can hold on to friends and perhaps impress them. So there's a real need with stress planets before this axis, before this house, I should say. There's a real need to feel secure in these situations that involve others. And it's where we creatively discover ourselves. And this is neither good nor bad statements. It's just really, it's not meant to be pathological in nature. It's really becoming aware of when there's a stress planet that we exert so much energy that it can rob other areas of the chart and become a real life story for the individual, all other things being equal. So that's why I'm pointing out these kind of red hot areas. Eighth house. So yes, for those in traditional astrology, I'm not saying the eighth house is not the house of death. It certainly is. Again, this is relating to life areas of living out in the real world as areas of expression. The eighth house, took me a while with this, in a biopsychosocial perspective, relates to the formal areas of society we align with. It's a more formal area than the seventh house of just relationships, business partners. We're fairly close and relatable in that area. The eighth house gets a lot more formalized. So the stress position in front of there is relating to other areas, but really a sense of self-worth through being an important part of society, taking on positions in organizations, law, you name it, that type of thing. All of these, by the way, just forming a picture in your head because I'm going to show you the books. They're laid out really well with the Hubers, so you can float along with this as well and dig into it at a larger level. So here's my groups of our weird friends, the ones we choose. Planets stressed in front of the 11th house. So they're in the 10th and they're just in front of that 11th house cusp. It's really about finding, keeping a song group of like-minded friends, people we can be safe and accepted with. It's our moral alignments we seek and want to be a part of. So these are opposite, more distant relationships in the 5th house. Emphasis is on really finding that strong group of like-minded friends that we can be safe and get along with. So there'll be a real massive story and emphasis with planets that are stressed and found there. So if you survived a bit of that, this is the last house, the mutable cross we're going to work through, houses 3, 6, 9, and 12. And they're fun. So there's this real urge to move away from the safety of the fixed houses and to learn about ourselves and others through different types of interactions. It took me, I kind of like that idea with the mutable cross. It took me a while to adjust of why are they calling it a mutable cross, but if we think, why do we travel? Why do we learn things in the 3rd house, et cetera, there can be this sense of interactions and relating and learning. So hence the mutable cross. What can I say for this cross? It's important to remember that stress plants, again, have to kind of manage the affairs of the house they're in as well as the strong pull forward. So they exert more energy than they have readily available. We can use this. Let me give you some examples. In front of the third house, there's this real search to relate, communicate. The planets want to fit in and can risk kind of conforming in the process. There can be a real risk of overemphasis and conforming if not checked. So what you kind of get is I'm holding on to second house, and then there's this third house kind of communicating, relating, and getting into. That's where the stress of that kind of point can land. As you know, the sixth house is health related, but also we can get into health issues with our level of service. So with a planet stressed in front of the sixth, as you would probably imagine, that idea of service, the real helper syndrome, need to feel connected through love, fears of loss can have a real psychosomatic effect at that level. They're really emphasized into that helper role. And I have a client example actually with this one. So plants in the stressed ninth position. This is an example of actually a client worked with many times. They collect degrees. So the emphasis is really on expanding philosophy through travel, knowledge, as you could imagine, that ninth house desirability. For they're on their third master's, this client. For them, it was walking through. I do multiple sessions with clients just because I talk a lot, probably more than anything, but also I think it takes time to really get to know our charts and to weave in the life journey and the biographical process. I get them to write a biography and I want to see where the juice is for them. And it really came down to this set of Jupiter and Neptune being stressed in front of the eighth house. There was this amazing amount of desire to collect degrees, work in the government, and working alongside health and governmental ideals around humanitarian profile, and obviously very altruistic pursuits with this acquisition desire. And it was really, really important. And they were wrestling with what's those existential questions. What's wrong with me? Why am I so pursued? Why do I pursue these interests so heavily and everything? That the astrology was really able to kind of support them and working with that and seeing these allergic stress points that it's not wrong. We just need to kind of work with it and see the compensation, sublimate it, and transform, which I'll get to in a little bit. You could just imagine this Jupiter, Neptune, and Sag stress position. And lastly, the enigmatic 12th house. I find this placement actually really liberating for clients because once it's understood, like Eckhart Tolle said, you need to let those needs of ours express. You shouldn't fight them. We really need to work with those inner needs of ourselves and not tuck them away, pretend they don't exist. When clients have deep ontological, teleological processing that certainly goes on in the 12th house, where we need to simply withdraw from the world to find realistic ways of letting that come into our lives in safe and real kind of tangible ways, but not to deny them. So I love actually seeing this in charts and with clients, that they can feel less as though it's a problem and just an area of life expression that needs to be understood. I'm going to quickly do an example just to tie a little bit of it in for you. For those familiar with former Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, UK, the Iron Lady, in her youth, she was labeled a serious, determined young woman. And ICI interviewed her I should say, I actually want to give credit to Marilyn Burnett from the Hubers, and she did a wonderful presentation on this, and I had to use many parts of it. ICI interviewed her as headstrong, obstinate, and dangerously self-opinionated. She did not get the job. She had a determination, to win. She ran twice in politics, failed the first 2 times, then went back to school to become a lawyer. Finally, in 1979, swept to victory as the UK's first female prime minister. So how the heck did she pull this off and achieve this? Fixed stars. Actually, yes, her fixed stars tell a very convincing story on their own, but we're talking stress planets today, so they do very nicely to really explain what's going on. To begin, she has 3 of them. We can see them here. We have the moon in front of the MC, sun in front of the 12th house, and Saturn digging its heels in Scorpio over there in front of the AC. Her sun, which is our autonomous mental self, our director of the will, it's what we use to determine what we're going to aim for and how we'll go about doing it. It's above the horizon. So it's in a conscious 11th house area where in the 11th house, we want to align ourselves with our chosen groups of friends and people that can kind of help our cause. Ideally, we find our friends that share our ideal. But in the stress zone before the 12th house, it's drawing us powerfully towards that kind of me part of the chart, deep within the 12th, towards that AC. So while she needs her friends to support her in that kind of 11th house business, she'll do her utmost to be independent. A tremendous tension ensues, real overkill, but can inspire confidence. It causes constant fear of falling short. To play with the moon, as we know, needs strong contact to feel connected. But up here, where the sun belongs, likes to be at least, the top of the chart, moon absolutely feels a little bit vulnerable. Her thinking and views and philosophies shared in the 9th house are stressed into the 10th. Where we want to shine, be our best. So she has to put on a little bit of an act and effort into getting attention, being popular, appearing competent. Stress is in how this moon allows her to play this part tremendously well. The effect is an overinflated sense of these kind of successes. Side note, the intercepted moon makes it very challenging to get that feeling nature out to others. You can see it's intercepted. Her press secretary had to constantly remind her to show more passion to the people. Now on to Saturn, which really I think seals the deal. The planet we use to keep us safe in the material world. Saturn in her chart has 2 main goals. In the stress position, in the 12th house, it is in the mutable, changing area of the house. It's very, very stressed, as I was showing. But patterned, rigid Saturn does not want change. So this is a person that likely didn't want to be born. With the AC representing our entry into the world, they felt what they were going to face was probably too difficult. So she's born into the world protecting herself at all costs. In the stress zone, it is doubly protected and will want to control the environment around her at all costs. Difficult birth placement produces a very tough ego and a solidified willpower. We famously see this in the 1980s election, and the critics were calling for a U-turn. She replied, "Turn if you want to, the lady is not for turning." So this was someone who was able to really live as she truly was, right? As the birth chart showcases, and employ that Saturn to her life and vocation. So that was a run through of the various kind of 3 house areas. And I'm going to, at this point, take you through how do we work with them. And we're getting on the presentation. Hope you're doing well. I call it compensation, awareness, sublimation, transformation. And they're fairly basic walkthroughs, as you can see, perhaps a little bit too basic, and that's, I think, a good thing, because the books are already written and you can go into it further, we can chat about it. At this point, I just want to land it in your brains. You can walk out of here and just seeing how, from a consultative, maybe a coaching or a therapeutic, or from the perspective of working at that kind of helping level, or just as the astrologer, how do you kind of give them something to walk away with? These are just some top level points. And again, to begin, stress planets, usually something as the client shows up on your doorstep or on your Zoom step, there's usually a crisis that wakens us up and we become aware of these compensations. The next phase of sublimation really means we find new, refined ways of working with these energies, conscious dealing with structure and these powers, so they can be best utilized. They don't just sit with the chart. We work with it, the icky, sticky business of working our charts. Anything we can do to bring into consciousness and awareness, we can work with and explore its needs. This is literally the work. It takes a lifetime. Pointing out a stress planet, or any point for that matter, in a birth chart is usually not enough. Of course, we need to engage with it and find ways of sublimating and kind of transmuting, transforming that energy. Transformation usually comes through a breakthrough moment of realization. And we have astrology for this. I'll just say before we start, you can obviously bring in everything you know. When are stress planets highlighted? Time lords, progressions, solar returns, any timing system you use, if they're getting impacted, can give you some insights. I always recommend what I call an astrobiography with clients to see, you can quickly spot the stress planets and then get them to really lay it out for you. How aware of them are they for you, and does their story match up with the reality of the birth chart? What's their chart story through a lifetime? In other words, where's the juice? Since stress planets operate unconsciously until they're made conscious, you're going to spot it in the client's story. Reality will just be. It's hard to say if the planet's working out well for them or not. It's only an issue if the client identifies it and is having a struggle with it. Maybe it's stressed and I had a client that's really running their business. They love their business and it was an absolute stress planet. Well, they love their business. They want to grow and work with it. But it was this idea of bringing it into consciousness and working with it and seeing how it's robbing the chart perhaps of other energy elsewhere, but not to sell the business or get rid of it or anything like that, but just to start to work with it so that we have a fully synthesized chart that we can express. In the first house, this is a planet that would be in the 12th house that's just peaking itself at that cusp of the first house, the AC. Obviously, what we're working with is the potentiality for the inflated ego or something like that that might have even suffered some defeats and brought down a few pegs. But really, it's a sense of proportion of those ego demands that are kind of met with reality is maybe what you might see from the client's edge. Cannot do things for the greater glory, and our ego will continue to face defeats. So transformation requires a bit of moving from that little self side of things. In the Mars in the 12th to the 1st, we just see it as the athlete that wants to overcompensate. So this would maybe be with other transpersonal planets or what have you. Mars is that motor drive is, I'm not saying that it's always an ego process, but this is largely what the research shows, that we need a sense of proportion between the two. In the fixed cross, as you can imagine, with that second house, there's something to be said. Again, I'm keeping this super easy. I just want this to land for you. Talk about money, talk about self-worth. There's going to be a story there. requiring sufficient resources for the tasks needed and not adding 15 car garages to your house unconsciously type of thing. In the second and third house stress position, we transform by becoming a messenger of the gods to serve up the group. There's this complete immersion in communal tasks, pass on the information, that type of thing. Stressed fourth house position, love of family and roots, lots potentially going on there, but going beyond building the dream home, especially if it's Jupiter, having both the home and family and the freedom is the dilemma and requires a renunciation, really probably at a bit of level of material things at that point. You can see how this wouldn't be a bit awkward for you, so you have to play with it with the chart, and I'll show you the books in a minute that the Hebrews detail in a lot stronger levels. In front of the fifth house, we kind of can work with transformation when we grant others what it needs without worrying about losing face. So our kind of personal involvement with the collective is being understood and matched. So it's not just about our creative kind of expression in the fifth and running around as you could maybe envision. In the sixth house, taking on duties gladly without looking for a reward. As we know, the stressed seventh house, it's really about becoming aware of what we're really made of being honest with themselves and others, a really strong emphasis brought to others and to others in that sense from an honest perspective. And we can be clean with it, not this kind of compulsion just around relationships and get us into trouble. So the awareness side of our needs and others at that kind of real formal relational level. As you would imagine, the eighth house, it gets a bit dicey. So you can't say the word eighth house without transformation. The energies from hate to love, revenge into forgiveness, possessiveness into renunciation. It's all about changing that motivation structure. Purification by many deaths and rebirth processes definitely fits the eighth house nicely. In front of the ninth house, long story short, there's a real recognition that we've seen with client I mentioned. Usually lots of knowledge is acquired, massive calling to be the teacher and to transform that energy to be the teacher. Move that information along at that ninth house level as opposed to the third house level requires us to get into sage mode a little bit, excuse me, and become a high level teacher. In front of the 10th, there's a mature manner to really wisely and use the power. The authority is kind of transformed when we renounce the ego and we're now there for others more prominently. It's that authority that's derived from inner strength and provides a real positive influence for others in leadership at that point. We can kind of build a large following or Facebook following, if you will, social media. And if it's left unchecked, it might become that we vehemently kind of guard it and defend it as a cause, but it's this kind of placement of the positive influence of leadership in that level. So planet with the 11th house, stress to the 11th, usually you might find clients arriving to you with a lot of losses in friendships. So you really need an ethic that needs to be developed that gives way to reality, allows everyone the same clear right of individuality. Those forged moralities, having a larger tolerance of higher ideals, not just your own opinions. So false ideas must give way to reality. And with the 11th house, there can be sometimes a story around losses and friendships in those kind of chosen groups. Finally, the enigmatic, secretive 12th house, transformation of stressed planets. To really play with these, it's usually a loss of love and trust that can be even deeper than the eighth house. The only kind of reaction is to retreat into the fantasy world. And really, it's about freeing yourselves from that stream of chaotic feelings before undergoing a death and rebirth. It's usually larger, potentially, than kind of an eighth house, if you could imagine that. And it really deals with finding a new spiritual center from which to operate. It's a heavy lesson. In short, we landed through those houses. I realize that's a lot of movement for you. I would say at this point, if you remember nothing else, that I would stick with this. It's been demonstrated in many cases that people use the energies of a planet before a house cusp differently than would otherwise be the case. This makes it more difficult to concentrate on one characteristic, which is why stress situations are so common. So keep it easy for yourselves. I'm going to show you the books that you can get started on if you're interested. First book, Transformation, Astrology as a Spiritual Path, was the latest that the Hubers wrote before Bruno passed away in, I believe it was 99. And it's got excellent in-depth write-up on a lot of areas, but absolutely the stress planets. I got a lot of information from there that I was especially working at that transformation level that you could dig in further with more planets and just eat your way through at it. The next book I highly recommend as to anybody, even my clients, as a, I don't want to say basic, but a front entry into grabbing a large picture of the Huber process. Talks about stress planets in there, the dynamic energy curve. It's doable, you can read it, it's very accessible, and they just actually went through a colored third edition year or two ago. Great book, very much worth it. I'm actually really excited though about this book, Astrological Psychology, because it's literally the diploma course book. The Huber approach was always done through this diploma system, and it was took many years to finish and complete the diploma, a lot of exams and you name it. And to really see the math and to dig into it deep, the Hubers, you can accept or reject anything I said, any of the processes, but at least with the Hubers, it's written down and they showed their work, and you can get in there and see if it makes sense for you. And I love that this book here, it's a great book, great big tome, really, physically big, and highly recommended. And I highly recommend the last book too, The Astrological Houses. It's excellent. Noel Till really has the introduction to it and speaks to much more of the math and the philosophy and the overview of why we speak and how the house system works as planets that are engaging with it on a real-time basis out in the real world with their birth charts. And lastly, if you want to calculate your Huber chart, I would recommend astro.com. And the way you do it is I realize that even the website's changed. I apologize for that, but find your way to extended chart selection. And what you want to get to is where it says chart type, select your natal chart wheel, and then select Huber style. And yes, you can actually select the house chart that I mentioned way back when, and also the moon node chart from there. But for your good old basic natal chart, just select the natal chart. And this Gemini is done talking at this point. I just want to say thank you. My website is theseewithinyou.com. I'm on Instagram and Facebook, but shoot me a message if I can pass off anything that could be useful for you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. It was quite interesting. Okay, so you're ready for questions?
Absolutely.
Okay, the first one is the technical. What time do you use for Mick Jagger?
Probably the wrong time. I have a good history of grabbing the wrong time for any of the charts I use. I can flip over and find out really quickly. I don't know. I'd have to, it's obviously in my charts. I just have to go and find it.
Okay.
Bring up another chart. I'll find it as we're talking.
Sure. Then another one, how do you interpret stressed Pluto in Scorpio just before Scorpio ascendant?
Yeah, I mean, at that point, we're any of the transpersonal planets, we need to accept them at obviously that level and realize that has the client taken them, how aware of these energies are they? What are they working with? And obviously the basics, what are they aspected to? Bring in everything else you know, but we're holding on a massive transpersonal planet. And I think if you mentioned the AC or any of those real PowerPoints is, I would recommend you're aware of it, you're labeling it as a stress planet. Now the consideration is engaging with the client at that level to see where that, I like the idea with Pluto of the unmodifiable principle for them, whereas that Plutonic unmodifiableness expressing for them so heavily in their chart that if that, I don't know if that helps or not, but you're going to have to obviously bring in that massive energy related to their life story. I find is obviously the most sensible way.
Thank you. Please repeat something. Thomas is asking, when you say in front of the house, in front of the house cusp and 5 degrees, you mean in any house, not only the houses on the corners?
Absolutely, yes. Any house, and in traditional astrology, how I was taught was, it seems to come up a lot of this idea of this 5 degree rule. And I would simply say, I mean, we're dealing with the house system. So if our birth time is off a little bit, we can get into trouble easy because we're working with the houses. So keep that in mind. But any planet that is the closer it gets to any house cusp, the more the idea of stress becomes more true. I would absolutely keep it simple like that for yourself as you wade into doing your own research and perhaps looking at your own chart or with your clients. But yes, great point. Any house.
Okay, I have a fascinating subject matter and quite involved. Thank you for this clarifying presentation. Stay well, stay safe. Then there is a question. Could the same principle of stress planet be applied to transit?
Yeah, great question. And I just finished a fascinating solar returns course for a month with amazing astrologer Shu Yap. And I was relating even areas that I didn't use a lot, so perfections and just new concepts, and still trying to see where my energy curve and the stress planets play in. And I would absolutely recommend you take in everything you know. The books are well laid out. The Hubers did great research. The Goklans did amazing research. Bring in your transits, bring in your stations, bring in anything that lands and relates to those, and let it become true for you. I call it psychosynthesis world fractional analysis. And when I work in transpersonal psychology with clients, it's this idea of going from the known to the unknown. So what you saw was not the truth from me, certainly you won't get that, but what it is this idea of stress planets. And you know that there's this idea that the closer they get to cusps, the more stressed they become. And as you peer into it further, then let everything you know with timing systems and everything else you throw at it in your chart and what your astrological profile and how you relate to it works, and then build outward. So it's going from the known to the unknown. And I love working with clients in imagery with that, but astrologically as well too. As you know, get a foundation for you. Yes, this is their birth chart. It's clearly their right birth time. And then bring in everything. Oh, okay, well, the biggest episode of my life in the biography they share with you was this. And then you relate it and you see you know, that solar return year, that massive transit or whatever the timing system is really relates to that stress planet, that is truth for it, then I would go with that and build with it, because then you've got levels of relatability to the chart. You're not just you know, making things up, if you will. I don't know if that helps.
Yes, thank you. Do you include the nodes and Chiron for these stress points?
Ooh, great question. I don't, I love Chiron. In the Huber approach, I don't bring them in. As you can see within the chart, he didn't pop up, but of course, Chiron, amazing. And any of the asteroids, I've actually been incorporating them a little bit more as I learn. Amazing. I don't know the answer. It's not within what I've used within the main planets, the psychological drives within it. Whoever asked that question, by all means, send me an email, and I would love to just explore more and love to hear. So great question.
Same
I wish I had an
person.
answer. Okay.
Yeah, it's Trudy. The same person, she's continuing with a few questions.
Yeah.
Can debilities and dignities be factored into the stress? For example, if Mars is exalted in Capricorn within 5 degrees of the 5th house?
Yeah. Great question. And yes, I mean, you got your moon in Cancer, so dignified. And what I also see with clients with a stressed moon in full dignity in that case, that it becomes the world's greatest daughter and cleans and takes care and nurtures, you know, whatever qualities around moon and Cancer can provide, to the point where it became such the best daughter that caused a lot of psychological wounding issues later on, because there was um, so much was done on that end without enough boundaries for it. So the stress, in other words, the stress still holds true because it's pulled in both areas. And if it's uh, more of on the ideal of a planet in its detriment or fall, then it's going to act out in a different way. But yeah, full dignity, you would think, would that subvert it or somehow keep it away from being stressed, and maybe it acts better or it acts more dignified. But in the case of my client, I don't, it actually, I pondered this, and I'm starting to see this with a lot more clients, that you know, the dignity level is one thing, but the stress, it comes at a level outward from it. And you can kind of see that within the birth chart. As the houses are furthest out, anything towards the center of the chart as we have more control over. So the dignity is still a level more inner until the environment grabs a hold of it and asks us to perform in two areas of life within the houses, for example. So yeah, great question.
Thank you. Same person. Also, what about the lots, like part of fortune?
Yeah, great question. I still use them quite a bit in horary, and I don't use them a lot in natal, to be honest with you. Not because they shouldn't. They absolutely should. Just I use my system, and I've not seen it come in with a stressed area. And perhaps I would even say I don't know, and that we should probably ask Kenneth Irving and go through some of the books and the research for the Go clans. I've not yet seen anything come up with lots as it relates, but I'm just gonna say I don't know.
Okay, thank you.
Great question though.
Farhan says, I also work with the Huber method, the formation of aspect patterns with the age point seems to be very important. I have also seen that important developments take place when the age point passes over the planet at the end of the house.
Yeah, great point. When I was building this out, I of course was just so thirsty to want to bring in the age point system and stress planets. So if you can remember back, I mentioned the timing system of age progression within the chart, this life clock, and the hand moves around, that for that timing tool, that time lord or progression of sorts, speaking to the question earlier about transits, absolutely that, what a great point that yes, of course, the age, once that stress planet becomes reality for the client through any mechanism, that's why I would keep it open. I don't want to, while I laid down a real Huber thing today, I think we should expand it obviously out and understanding we're using cook houses. You know, I don't mean to make you change your house system, but look at it through that lens, and then maybe change it back to your normal house system, and then just see how those stress planets for you and your clients are really playing out in any timing progression method. So, great point.
Thanks. Just one technical information. Ellie asked if the slides would be available. No, it won't. Then the next one is Francis. With Placidus house system, I have many planets right before the cusp, but with the Koch house system, these planets are right over the cusp. What is the significance of having no stress planets, but planets just past the cusp?
Great question. And the Go clans did their research using Placidus, right? So do a biography for yourself, you know your chart best. And if it's the main angles, what I would say from the Huber and Koch side would be that if they're just on any planet that's just on, like I showed in that picture way back when, just on the counterclockwise side of the cardinal cuspal zone, what we say is that they're very cardinal, very able to perform, very expressionary. You see this through even solar returns. If they're really close to the cusp, they can be a bit like a child that just had the training wheels taken off the bike. They're just getting going and they're really vibrant and able to perform. I mean, we tend to love those kinds of cuspal planets because the environment gets on with them really well, but maybe that's a good consideration for dignity. Say you have a lot of planets with lacking essential dignity, they're really available to the environment being very cuspal. Well, great opportunity to really work with the client to, if it's becoming a problem for them, it gives then you as the astrologer another way to say, yes, they're very cuspal, very available. The environment sees those and you're just very interacting with the environment. And did you know that a moon in Scorpio or a Jupiter in Capricorn with its lacking dignity type of approach, how that is playing out in real time for the client, if that helps? But yeah, I mean, we love cuspal planets just because we can do a lot with them at a very real level.
What is the significance of having planets at the low point of the energy curve, and are there any positive effects?
Great point. I've got a lot. So I'll need therapy after this. So my moon's at a low point. What it is low point planets are closer to the chart center. They tend to be very aware. They're available to the core. We have access to our inner sources with them, our soul level work, if you will. It's becoming aware of the low point. And when we're aware of the low point, we can sensitively move that planet out into the world because we're using it more delicately and maybe not throwing it around. So my sun in the 5th at a low point, I mean, growing up, the impressed behaviors we can get in the 5th of wanting to look good and in that friendly area and be impressed upon and creative side. When it's a low planet, we need to find ways to work with it more healthily. It's not as easy to express if the planet would be cuspal in any house. So if it was right in the cuspal zone, the cardinal zone, that 5th house, it would be a lot easier. I mean, as we know, 10th house planets, right? If they're in that, especially in that cardinal zone in the 10th house, they're you know, all things being equal, standard kind of statement within astrology. But when they're at the low point, you'll find people capable of that the strength of it is really the inner awareness, which is huge, right? Having inner awareness they're meant for other things in life. And yes, they can be effective out in the real world, but we need to just sensitively work with it.
Thank you. Farhan is just commenting, in newer studies, also Chiron is taken. I take it too in the Huber method. Working with Chiron gives also good results in the Huber method.
Absolutely. And what I tend to do is I treat the chart structure, I leave it in the Huber approach. I don't bring in asteroids because I actually use the image and the inner wiring room, and I get so much information from that image that's formed with just sticking with the classical and the 3 extra transpersonal planets. But then I click in my little orb file and bring in Chiron, and as I'm learning more about the asteroids, the 4 main, the goddesses, I think that's how I approach it. But yeah, hugely great point. And honestly, I don't know. I think that I'm really interested in hearing from others how they get on with Chirons, because I'm not a Chiron expert. So I'm excited. Just stay in touch with me. I'd love to hear what you can bring into the fold.
Marlene asks, what is the nodes chart about? I pulled mine up in astra.com, and the nodes are not opposite each other. Also, planets have changed degrees, but this doesn't look like a draconic chart.
Yeah, it was the draconic and the moon node, similar, completely different, that whole story. It's a mirror chart, and it can really, if it helps, without getting too technical with it, what really happens is that the north node in the natal chart becomes the AC and the moon node chart, and the AC and the moon node chart becomes the north node in the natal chart. And the calculations for it are actually described well in, I don't know if you can see this, I'll bring it up. This is the book here, Moon Node Astrology. And I highly recommend that, along with Astrological Psychology, the other big book I mentioned. The calculations are in there and how to work with it and use it. And you're dealing with the shadow persona. I thought somebody had sucked it out of their thumb when I first started studying it. I was never going to use it. I'm fairly concrete. I like my information to be concrete. But I got into it and I realized so many depth psychologists have worked and they've used and done so much research with this book. So back to the Hubers, I mean, they would test something and run it through thousands and thousands of astrologers and client files, and they would have a whole system of moving the data around. So playing with the shadow is really what you're doing with the moon node chart. And I would absolutely recommend getting into it. It's taken me 5 or 6 years, and I think I only use the basics, but then I stick, depends on the client. So explore it, and it's well detailed is probably my best advice.
Thank you. This has been a fantastic presentation. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
Then another one. Thank you, Mark. Huber astrology now makes so much sense than before.
It's different, yeah, but yeah, it's different, and yet I think if you get into it, you see that it's really just using traditional concepts in few ways. And I think appreciating that you're not going to dig this book up from Al Biruni and what have you. It's kind of a new astrology, and it is what it is. It's not the best. I study traditional too. I'm always trying to relearn, as most astrologers learn everything. But the Hubers detailed their work and they showed their work. So if it entices you, you can check it out.
Yes, thank you, Mark. Okay, Fox, this was all, and all for today or for tonight, depending on where you're stationed. And thank you, Mark, for this really inspiring presentation. I believe that everybody is going to look into it now that they're interested a little bit more. And thank you for joining ISAR Starclub with your presentation. Also, thank you guys, everybody, for being here, and please look it up for all our new Starclub webinars. We have United Kingdom Starclub, so please join there, and very soon Australia and New Zealand. So there's going to be many interesting webinars.
Excellent.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye, and stay safe.
Stay safe. Thanks, Zarana. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mark. Bye.
Bye.